July 2, 1937. High above the massive, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a single plane is flying two of the world's most famous aviators towards a tiny speck of land they can't see. Inside, Amelia Earhart, America's favorite pilot, and her navigator Fred Noonan are pushing through the last, most dangerous part of their trip around the world. But they're almost out of fuel. They're lost. And after a few garbled, desperate radio calls, there's only silence. For over 80 years, the world has held on to a simple, tragic story. They ran out of fuel, crashed into the ocean, and were gone. The plane and its legendary pilot were just swallowed by the sea. It's a clean, sad ending to an incredible life. But what if that story, the one the US government still officially tells, isn't the whole story? What if the official narrative is just a convenient cover for a truth that is far more disturbing? New evidence, pieced together from decades of painstaking work, suggests the greatest aviation mystery of the 20th century isn't really about what happened in the air, but about the horrifying ordeal that happened on the ground. The final chapter of Amelia Earhart's life wasn't a quick plunge into the ocean, but a slow, agonizing slide into desperation on a deserted island. The search for Amelia Earhart has been looking in the wrong place for almost a century. The mystery has, for all practical purposes, been solved. And the truth of her last days is far more chilling, and so much worse, than we ever dared to imagine. To really get why her disappearance was such a massive deal, you have to understand who Amelia Earhart was. In the 1930s, she wasn't just a pilot, she was a global phenomenon. In a time when aviation was the final frontier and it was dominated by men, Earhart didn't just break records, she shattered stereotypes with a quiet and steely resolve. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, a flight that made her a household name and a symbol of female independence. She was daring, smart, and incredibly ambitious. By 1937, she was going after the ultimate prize, to be the first woman to circle the entire globe. This wasn't just another flight, it was a massive undertaking. A 29,000-mile journey that would push both her and her plane to the absolute limit. Her partner for this quest was the Lockheed Electra 10E, a cutting-edge, twin-engine aircraft. Purdue University, where Earhart worked as a visiting faculty member, helped pay for the plane, which she considered a flying laboratory that she planned to return after her trip. The world was watching, completely captivated, as she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, flew from one continent to the next. They went from Miami to South America, across Africa, through India, and over Southeast Asia. By late June of 1937, they had already flown over 22,000 miles. Only one huge obstacle was left, the vast, featureless Pacific Ocean. The last and most critical leg was a grueling 18-hour flight from New Guinea, to a tiny coral atoll named Howland Island. Howland was barely a mile and a half long. It was a tiny target in the middle of the world's biggest ocean. Finding it meant their navigation had to be perfect. There was zero room for error. People have compared finding Howland Island to trying to find a single needle in a haystack the size of the United States. To help guide them, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was waiting just off the coast of the island. Its main job was to act as a radio beacon, a homing signal for Earhart to lock onto. On paper, it was a solid plan. But in the real world of 1930s aviation, flying over the most remote stretch of water on Earth, that plan was about to completely fall apart. On July 2, 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from into the dark, pre-dawn sky. They were never seen again. The last few hours of the flight are just a mess of confusion and rising panic. The radio logs from the Itasca show a flight in serious trouble. Earhart's radio calls were choppy and hard to understand. She could apparently hear the Itasca, but the ship couldn't seem to get a solid radio lock on her. The issue was a mix of incompatible radio frequencies and technologies. Earhart was talking on a frequency the Itasca could hear, but she couldn't receive their voice transmissions, only their Morse code signals, and it's not even clear if she was properly set up for that. It was a complete, and fatal, communication breakdown. Her last confirmed message came in at 8:43 a.m., local time. Her voice was strained, cutting through the static with clear panic. "We are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6,210 kilocycles. Wait." Then, another piece of a message: "We are running on line north and south." That was it. The line 157-337 was a line of position, something Noonan would have calculated from a sun sighting. It meant they were somewhere along that line. The problem is, that line is thousands of miles long. Without another line to cross it, their position was little more than a guess. The crew of the Itasca could only listen, helpless, as her voice just faded away. Almost immediately, the U.S. launched the biggest and most expensive sea search in its history up to that point. For 16 days, the Navy and Coast Guard searched 250,000 square miles of ocean. 66 planes and 9 ships, including the battleship USS Colorado, looked everywhere around Howland Island. They found nothing. No oil slick. No floating wreckage. Not a single piece of the Electra. With absolutely no evidence to go on, the U.S. government arrived at the only conclusion it felt it could. On January 5, 1939, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were officially declared dead. The final report stated they simply ran out of fuel, crashed into the Pacific, and sank. This crash and sink theory became the official story, the one put in history books for the next 80 years. It was simple, it was logical, and it was a tidy end to the story, but for a small group of dedicated researchers, that story never felt right. The fact that there was zero wreckage was strange. A plane of that size, especially with huge, empty fuel tanks, should have left some kind of debris field. So why was there nothing? And then there was the other evidence the Navy either missed or ignored in its rush to close the case. Evidence of faint, desperate calls for help that were heard for days after her plane supposedly vanished. The official story, as neat as it was, started to show cracks almost right away. The first major problem was the radio signals. While the Itasca heard nothing after that last call, other people did. Over the next week, more than 100 different post-loss radio signals were reported by listeners all over the Pacific, and some even in North America. These weren't just random static. Many were credible reports, coming from Navy listening posts and amateur radio operators, of a woman's voice, speaking English, asking for help. One woman in Canada claimed she heard a voice say, "We have taken in water. We can't hold on much longer." A housewife in Texas named Betty Klenk kept a detailed notebook of the signals she picked up. She wrote down phrases like, "New York City, call, wire. Cat calling." Along with pleas for help, noting the voice sounded frantic and terrified. For years, Betty's notebook was dismissed as just a fantasy. But modern analysis of her notes reveals a shocking consistency with what you'd expect from a castaway trying to work a damaged radio. The most important part of these signals wasn't just what they said, but where they might have come from. While you couldn't pinpoint a radio signal's exact origin in the 1930s, you could triangulate it. By taking bearings from several listening posts, in places like Hawaii and Wyoming, you could plot a rough position. And when several of the most believable signals were triangulated, they didn't point to the open ocean around Howland Island. They all pointed to the same place, a small, uninhabited atoll about 350 nautical miles to the southeast. An island then called Gardner Island. Today, we call it Nikumaroro. The idea that Earhart might have landed there was actually considered during the original search. On July 9, a full week after she disappeared, planes from the USS Colorado flew over Gardner Island. The pilot reported seeing signs of recent habitation, but then just dismissed it, wrongly assuming people lived on the island. They didn't. The signs he saw whatever they were from someone who shouldn't have been there. The search planes flew on, and the Gardner Island lead went cold. For the Navy, the case was closed. But for a new generation of investigators, it was really just the beginning. This is where the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIRE, comes in. Founded in 1985 by aviation historian Rick Gillespie, TIRE has spent over 3 decades focused on one single theory: that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan didn't crash at sea. They made an emergency landing on the flat coral reef of Gardner Island, and for a short time, they survived as castaways. This isn't just some wild conspiracy theory. It's a scientific investigation built on 4 key pillars of evidence: the radio signals, historical records, archaeology, and forensics. The first pillar was those radio calls. TIRE's team re-examined every documented signal that was heard after the plane vanished. They noticed something critical: the signals were only ever heard at night. This made perfect sense. The Electra's engines would have to be running to recharge the batteries for the plane's powerful main radio. They could only run the engines if the plane was on solid ground. And with the tide rolling in every day, the plane would have been swamped with water, shorting out the electrical system. They could likely only broadcast at low tide, which in that specific location happened at night. The pattern of the signals was a huge clue that they were coming from land. The second pillar was historical evidence. TIRE dug up a British colonial report from 1940, 3 years after the disappearance. A British officer, Gerald Gallagher, had been sent to Gardner Island to see if it was suitable for settlement. In a far corner of the island, he found a partial human skeleton, buried near what looked like an old campfire. Next to it, he found a woman's shoe, a box that once held a sextant for navigation, and the remains of birds and turtles, suggesting someone had been trying to survive there. Gallagher sent the bones to Fiji to be analyzed. There, a doctor named D.W. Hoodless measured them and, using the limited forensics of the 1940s, concluded the bones belonged to a short, stocky man. He dismissed any link to Earhart. Then, tragically, the bones themselves were lost, probably thrown out during World War II. For decades, that was the end of it. The bones were male. Case closed. But TIRE found Dr. Hoodless' original notes and measurements in an archive. They gave them to modern forensic anthropologists. In 2018, a new study was published. Using modern forensic databases and techniques, scientists reanalyzed Hoodless' data. Their conclusion was stunning: the bone measurements were more similar to Earhart than to 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. The analysis strongly suggested the bones found on Nikomaroro belonged to Amelia Earhart. The lost skeleton was almost certainly hers. This brings us to the third pillar: archaeology. Since the 1980s, TIRE has led over a dozen trips to Nikomaroro. The island is a harsh, unforgiving place, but it has slowly given up its secrets. At the Castaway campsite, the same spot where the bones were found, they've dug up a collection of artifacts that paint a personal picture of who was there. They found a small jar of what turned out to be a 1930s brand of anti-freckle cream. Amelia was known to be self-conscious about her freckles. They found pieces of a woman's shattered compact mirror. They found a zipper from a flight jacket, a pocketknife like the one Noonan carried, and a sharpened piece of plexiglass, maybe used as a tool. Any single artifact could be explained away. But together, they create a clear picture. These are not the belongings of a Pacific Islander. They are the personal items of a stranded American woman from the 1930s. One of the most powerful finds was a piece of aluminum aircraft siding, found back in 1991. For years, no one could prove it came from her plane. But then, researchers found a newspaper photo of Earhart's Electra taken right before her final flight. The photo clearly showed a custom patch that had been installed over a window, a one-of-a-kind modification. The rivet pattern on that patch was a perfect match for the piece of aluminum found on the island. As Rick Gillespie said, it was a fingerprint. The fourth pillar is the ongoing search for the plane itself. The theory is that after landing on the reef, the Electra sat there for several days, allowing them to make those radio calls. But eventually, the powerful surf would have dragged the plane off the reef and into the deep ocean. For years, sonar searches have been conducted on the deep, dangerous slopes off Nkomaroro's reef. In 2012, Tyre's sonar images showed a scatter of man-made objects on the slope, which would be consistent with a plane being torn apart. More recently, an expedition is planned for late 2025 by Purdue University and the Archaeological Legacy Institute to investigate a satellite anomaly in the island's lagoon, which some believe could be part of the Electra. This shouldn't be confused with the 2024 announcement by a company called Deep Sea Vision. They released sonar images of an aircraft-shaped object much closer to Howland Island, but later analysis suggested this was most likely a natural rock formation, so the search continues. For now, the most convincing evidence, the radio calls, the bones, the personal items, all point to Nkomaroro. This is where the story shifts from a historical mystery to a human tragedy. The evidence doesn't just suggest that Earhart and Noonan landed on Nkomaroro, it forces us to imagine what their final days, weeks, or even months must have been like. And this is why the truth is so much worse than a simple crash. It's one thing to imagine a quick, decisive end. It's another thing entirely to picture a slow, agonizing death as a castaway. Picture it. They pull off a miraculous landing on the coral reef. They're alive, but they are completely stranded. For the first few days, there's probably hope. They grab what they can from the plane. They use the radio at night during low tide, sending out calls, listening for a response that never arrives. But after a few days, the ocean wins. A storm or just the relentless waves drag the Electra off the reef, and it sinks into the dark, taking their only real hope of rescue with it. The silence after that must have been absolute. Now, they are truly alone. Nkomaroro is not some tropical paradise. It's a harsh, waterless strip of coral. Finding fresh water would have been the most desperate, immediate problem. They would have had to collect any rain they could in whatever they had. For food, they ate fish, seabirds, and turtles. The campsite is littered with their bones, many showing signs of being cooked over a fire. They were resourceful. They were survivors, but the island had other residents. Nkomaroro is crawling with giant coconut crabs, some of which can grow up to 3 feet across with claws strong enough to crack coconuts. A truly gruesome theory has been put forward by some researchers to explain why the skeleton found in 1940 was so scattered. It's possible that after Earhart died from injury, thirst, or starvation, the crabs were drawn to her body, scavenging her remains and dragging the bones away. It's a horrifying image, but it's consistent with both the evidence and the island's ecosystem. And then think of the psychological toll. Amelia Earhart was a global celebrity who had the world's attention. Now, she was an anonymous speck on an endless ocean, her calls for help unheard. Fred Noonan, a master of navigating by the stars, was now trapped on a tiny prison of coral, unable to navigate his way home. What did they talk about as the weeks passed? Did hope give way to resignation, and resignation to despair? Did they die together, or did one have to watch the other fade away? This is the grim truth of the Nkomaroro hypothesis. It replaces the clean tragedy of a plane crash with a long, brutal story of human suffering. It's a story of incredible resilience followed by a lonely, inevitable death. There was no single, dramatic moment of impact. There was just the slow, grinding horror of trying to survive, fighting every single day against thirst, hunger, and hopelessness, only to die on a forgotten shore with crabs as the only witnesses. This wasn't a quick ending. It was a long nightmare. And knowing the ordeal she likely went through is so much worse than just believing she was lost at sea. For almost a century, the Amelia Earhart mystery has always been about where she is. But the evidence today suggests we should have been asking a different question all along: what did she endure? While expeditions continue to search for that final, undeniable proof of the Electra, the mountain of evidence points overwhelmingly to one grim conclusion. The story of Amelia Earhart isn't about a pilot who failed. It's the story of a castaway who fought to survive against impossible odds and ultimately lost. The official story might be easier to swallow, but the truth, in all its terrifying detail, is a far more powerful testament to the human will to live. The mystery isn't gone, but its focus has shifted from the sky to the shore, from a missing plane to a story of human endurance taken to its absolute limit. What do you think? Does the evidence for the Nikomaroro theory convince you? Or do you think one of the other theories is the real answer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this investigation compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next look into history's greatest unsolved mysteries.